Hey everybody, we are back. It is your host, Rob Keents of 𝙂𝙍𝙊𝙎. This is Cowboy Metals live every Tuesday, usually at 5:30 p.m. Central Time. Today, we're doing it at 5:45 to give us a little bit of extra time to prepare for the presentation we have for you today. Thank you, everybody, for dropping by the live stream and voting in the poll and being a part of our video today of the live. Appreciate you guys always showing up. China and Russia stand up to the U.S. with a new world reserve currency. That's a subject of our presentation today, and I'm going to get into that and how all of that works. Let's do a real quick sound check, make sure you guys can hear me. Looks good so far. All right, we have a poll up. In the poll, the question is, China, Russia, and a whole bunch of other nations stand up to the dollar and U.S. and Western hegemony. What happens? The BRIC currency unseats the dollar. The BRIC currency fails to impress. The BRIC currency weakens the dollar. Or the dollar rules the world forever with just over 60% of the vote. It's the third one. The BRIC currency weakens the dollar. Please feel free to vote in the poll. If you guys are listening to this afterwards on the read broadcast or the podcast, you won't have the poll, but that's okay. I'll read out the results at the end of the program today for you. Thank you, everybody, for jumping on with us. We're going to go ahead and get started on the presentation. Again, talking about the dollar as the world's reserve currency and what that means. We'll go ahead and get the screen shared on the PowerPoint presentation that I want to share with you guys. We're going to put that into presentation mode, and I'm going to go back and make sure that we are getting that on the live stream as well. We are live, guys. We are ready to go with the presentation. The title of this presentation, China and Russia stand up to the US dollar, the beginning of the end of a super major financial era. And by super major, I mean Bretton Woods and the subsequent pure fiat era starting 1971 until now. That entire era where the dollar became and resided as the world's reserve currency is coming to an end very quickly. I originally talked about this probably about a little over a year ago. And actually, I talked about it for longer than that. I've talked about the central bank digital currency since 2018. But my entire thesis for how China and Russia are going to band together and form this currency, recapitalize their banking system goal, all of that stuff's in this presentation. But I originally started talking about this years ago and then really started focusing on about a year and a half ago, and people weren't really listening to me, thought I was crazy. They said the dollar would never fall. You've got the dollar milkshake theory. You've got the dollar's a world reserve currency. You've got, for the last how many years, the Fed has been the dominant central bank. But the point I like to make is the dominance of any one fiat system or any one financial system never lasts past a certain point. We've talked about the research from Kondratiev, a Russian political economist. We've talked about the research from Sir John Glubb, who has studied nation states. Go back and look at those presentations. But it's pretty clear that every single dominant nation on earth and dominant currency system has reset, and they reset in cycles. And the cycles are remarkably close to each other. That's what we're going to talk about. The next step of what we're going to see in the world on that. This is going to be movie themed, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to add a little bit of fun to it today. So this slide is called From Russia with Love. And this is an article from Russia Times. BRICS developing a new global reserve currency. According to Putin, it will be based on a currency basket of the 5-nation bloc, according to a Russian president. President Vladimir Putin said on Wednesday, that'd be last Wednesday, that the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are currently working on setting up a new global reserve currency. I have said multiple times in the last years on Seeking Alpha and social media that China would challenge for dominance of the dollar as world reserve currency. People told me I was nuts and they wanted no part of it. You were wrong. I was right. Sorry, I don't mean to be a jerk about that, but sometimes I'm kind of way ahead of the game on here, and it's just because I follow the clues. You weren't wrong to think that it could happen in the near term because we had been in the system for so long, but all of the data in the scuttlebutt in the press basically told us what was coming. It says here, the issue of creating an international reserve currency based on a basket of currencies of our countries is being worked out, he said at the BRICS Business Forum. According to the Russian president, the member states are also developing reliable alternative mechanisms for international payments. We'll get to those other mechanisms here in a moment and tell you what they do and what they don't do and what additional steps Russia and China need to use those. I'm going to go back and check on the stream here real quick, make sure we are going strong. Everything sounds good. So we will go back to the presentation, ladies and gentlemen. Now, remember, this is a choice based on what the US Western system did to everybody else, exporting inflation. giving them dominance in every market, putting the American business market at the world, or at the front of the stage of the world, you know, the biggest and strongest economy ever. That's what reserve currencies allow you to do. And the rest of the nations are tired of all the advantages the United States has had and its partners in this system, and they're starting to change it. According to the Russian president, the member states are also developing reliable alternative mechanisms. I read that. Earlier, the group said it was working on establishing a joint payment network to cut reliance on the Western financial system. The BRICS countries have also been boosting the use of local currencies. Now, that joint payment network is not quite there. Russia and China both have a piece, but it's missing something. We'll get into details. Next slide. Hey, you won't mind if I fight back, will you? This is what the Chinese and Russians are saying. According to Business Insider, Russia and the other BRICS countries are working on an alternative reserve currency that would rival the IMF's SDR. And I'll tell you why that's not quite possible here in just a moment. But it's pretty close. They just need some extra steps. Russia and China are developing a new reserve currency with other BRICS countries. President Vladimir Putin said, this is per the businessinsider.com article, the basket currency would rival a US-dominated IMF alternative and let Russia widen its influence, an analyst said. So that's where they're talking about challenging the IMF's SDR, special drawing rights, which is considered basically a top-level type of currency across central banks that participate in the IMF system. And the SDRs also have the Chinese yuan as a component. The dollar dominance is already eroding as central banks diversify into the Chinese yuan and smaller currencies. So those are some of the details for you. If you have questions, remember, super chats are open, ladies and gentlemen. You guys can come back to the program or get me to come back to the program and answer questions by throwing up a super chat. I'll get notified and we'll do that. Thank you, Peter Froheim, for riding shotgun and doing moderation duties. Thank you for being here as always. Thank you everybody for being here. Niels, Han, Dynasty is in the house. We have Sarge is here. Sarge is always here. Thank you, Sarge. Caleb Myers is here. Spiked Head Die Crack rejoins us on the program. We have John Ginger. We have Vedant Mike P, commentator, Charles McClendon, and many more. Sorry if I didn't call your names, but glad that you are here on the program. Let's get back to the presentation, if we will. So as we go down the presentation, we notice that the dollar de-dollarization has accelerated to ludicrous speed. This is, of course, a reference to Spaceballs, the movie that was making fun of the Star Wars franchise. And the quote here is, the dollar has long been seen as the world's reserve currency, but its dominance in share of international currency reserves is waning. Central banks are looking to diversify their holdings into currencies like the yuan, as well as into non-traditional areas like the Swedish krona and the South Korean won, according to the International Monetary Fund. That would be the IMF. Now, all of the quotes and the data, or most of the data, or all the data that I use in this presentation will be on the last slide where I put my references. I'll leave it up on screen for a minute. You can pause and print screen and go look at those if you want, plus a bunch of other knowledge I've accumulated over time, but I've tried to cite the specific things I called in here. So if you're wondering where I'm getting all this stuff, I'll show you at the very end. And of course, it's all over for the dollar, but the crying, of course, the movie we have here is the Tom Hanks baseball one about the women's league. There is no crying in baseball, his famous quote from that movie. This is a move to address the perceived U.S. hegemony of the IMF. Ing's global head of markets, Chris Turner, said in a note. Now, this is not an Eastern financial group. Ing, I've had their insurance before, is a Western, basically a European-based financial company that does a lot of insurance and things like that. So this is one of the Western analysts saying this. He said, it will allow BRICS to build their own sphere of influence and unit of currency within that sphere. So it's very clear even to Western analysts that Russia and China have done exactly what everybody said they wouldn't do, and it's challenged the dollar. Well, they're doing exactly that. And we're going to talk as we go further into it, what they're able to challenge, what they're not able to challenge. And we're going to start here talking about the Russian transfer system. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We have almost 200 in the house. Appreciate all you guys for being here. Of course, the reference here is the movie Rocky, and I believe it's either the third or fourth one where the Russian guy basically kills Apollo and Rocky comes back and fights him. I think Rocky comes back in movie 4. And that is the Russians basically saying, we're going to knock you out because guess what? Mama said knock you out. So here's the number of financial messages in Russia as reported by the Bank of Russia, the BIS, and the IIF, and as printed at Econofact. You can see those references at the bottom of the screenshot. here and here. And you can see that the Bank Russia SPFS system, which is kind of like SWIFT, but not a complete replacement because it focuses on ruble transactions on and offshore, but mostly within Russia, not necessarily exchanges between currencies. So you can see where it needs a little bit of improvement. If they're going to link all these BRICS system currencies together, they're going to need better systems. But SPFS is the base of the Russian financial messages system, which is more of a direct competitor to what the US has than the Chinese chip systems, which we'll get to that in a moment. People have reported that the Chinese system is a replacement for SWIFT, but in fact, it relies on and uses SWIFT for its messaging, whereas that Chinese system is more for settlement. So China has to get out of SWIFT and build another piece of their international payment system and connect it to Russia SPFS to really rival the SWIFT system. And then they got to get all those other countries on it as well, all the rest of the BRICS nations that want to be in there. So they haven't done all the work yet, and we'll talk about that next. But we want to compare and contrast China's wire transfer system with the US's wire transfer system. The US is called SWIFT here on the left. The China is called CIPS on the right. SWIFT was launched in 1977 to ensure secure messaging between global financial institutions. It facilitates movement of funds, but it does not move funds itself. Aha, so SWIFT is not the transfer system. It is the messaging system which enables the transfers to occur and the banks to settle up at the end of the day. CIPS was established in China in 2015 to clear and settle onshore and offshore renminbi or yuan transactions. It moves funds by using SWIFT-enabled messaging. So CIPS is more of a replacement for SWIFT in that it has messaging, but it's, it uses SWIFT messaging, but it's more of a settlement. So CIPS relies on SWIFT and cannot operate without SWIFT at the current time. Although if I were China, I'd be working on getting out of SWIFT to begin with. Just do your own protocol and make that work. SWIFT was created to standardize interbanking communications. CIPS was created to increase the efficiency and lower the cost of the transactions. SWIFT, you can see, has many more participants, 1,100 participating in 200 countries. CIPS does have, however, 11,000 for SWIFT. CIPS has 1,280 in 103 countries, so not quite the same, but you can see the progress that they've made. And if you put the Russian system and the CIPS system together and then add some messaging capability and then connect all the dots with the other banks in the other countries and get them licensed and using that system, then you could have a true replacement for the Western wire or payment transfer system, but it's not quite there yet. So they've done a lot of work. Not quite there. I'm going to go back and check on the chat and see how you guys are doing. I still don't see super chats. Any questions that you guys want me to answer? So we're going to do a real quick reset and then go back into the presentation. So it is August 2nd, 2022. Your Cowboy Metals Live with Rob Kientz, your host from goldsilverpros.com. We are broadcasting from the great state of Texas, where we take no BS and we tell you the truth. And we're not here to get you to do anything other than to educate yourself and make you a better investor and make you more wise as to what's going on in the international financial system and how that's going to affect you in many, many, many different ways. The formal title of this presentation, China and Russia stand up to the US with new world reserve currency. Back to the presentation, ladies and gentlemen. We are going back to the PowerPoints. Here's what they still have to do. So the reference to the movie, Russia and China still have financial bosses. So they're not quite free from the bosses just yet, just like this gentleman here isn't in the movie. And a few quotes from a couple of different sources. SWIFT and CIPS were created for different purposes. A cooperative of mostly Western banks created SWIFT in the 1970s as a set of standards for international financial messaging. The objective of SWIFT was to ensure collective ease and interbank communication. In contrast, the Chinese government created CIPS to support RMB clearing and settlement on and offshore, and to aid their objective to make the RMB more attractive. It is narrowly focused on boosting China's economic and financial prowess. China's CIPS alone would not help Russia evade the full brunt of US and allied sanctions until the renminbi becomes a major player in international finance. Well, that has started because I told you about it's included in the SDR. Let's talk about that. While the renminbi share of global payments via SWIFT has been rising, the upward trajectory is minuscule, from 1.65% in 2020 to 3.2% in 2022, although I would like to point out it almost doubled in 2 years. So while the percentage of renminbi payments via SWIFT is small, it is rising and doubling the last 2 years, and we'll see what happens. I think that's going to accelerate. I think it'll more than double as China and Russia continue building the system and get everybody on it to help support the new BRICS currency. Chinese policymakers have to contend with a policy paradox, the article says. China wants SIPs to be connected to the world, yet also be a viable alternative to existing financial institutions. This is because SIPs need SWIFT to operate in international finance. Well, all China has to do is put in option 2, which is their alternative to SWIFT, and they could use this system as a bridge between the BRIC currency system and the Western system with the dollar at the top. Because SIPs will sit on top of the messaging system, they could potentially have it connect to both SWIFT and their system at the same time, and that would allow them to conduct international transactions using that system, still participate in the Western market, but build over time the alternative and the competitor without fully exiting the American system, which it can't do right now because their system isn't there yet. But what we have ultimately is the red wedding of communist countries are killing King Dollar. This is, of course, in reference to the Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin that was on HBO in a TV series called Game of Thrones. Very, very famous. And the red wedding is where House Stark fell. They were murdered and essentially betrayed. And that's essentially what's happening to the Western system, although a lot of people say the Western elites deserve it. I'll leave that up to you to decide. At the end of the day, this is a betrayal of that system and a functioning of a new world, and therefore is a red wedding for the Western payment system and the Western dollar-based system. The Indian government was considering a Russian proposal to use the SPFSS for payments in rubles, Bloomberg reported in March. It's also mulling using the Chinese yuan as a currency to reference the rupee-rubles trade, India's Mint media outlet reported last month. So India's getting in there saying, I know China and Russia's got something going on. I just want to connect to what they do, and then we can exchange rupee for rubles. But I want to connect to what they do. Why? So we can facilitate transactions. If you get India, China, Russia, Brazil, South America, some of these Middle Eastern countries, Turkey's considering joining, Saudi Arabia is considering joining, and you get them all on this system, then essentially you have a viable alternative with a lot of the competing economies in the world, a major amount of them, and the two biggest emerging economies, two biggest in terms of population, China and India, both participating. Now you're talking a good alternative to the dollar. Now this is very interesting. Now, not all pieces are in place yet, but they're getting them in. And again, I've been talking about this for years. People said I was nuts. They said I was nuts. Well, I'm not nuts. Well, obviously, this is what's been happening. So you can go back to my old articles on Seeking Alpha. They're dated and still up on Seeking Alpha, a website which attracts about 20 million visitors every month. It is a major news financial magazine. Go back and look at where I talked about the death of the dollar, the CBD says all this. I've been talking about it for years, all of this. And you can go back and look at where I talked about this and said, this is why I think it's going to happen. And in fact, the very earliest reference I had to China setting up an alternative currency system was in, I believe, chapter 5 or 6 of my book called Drop Shadow, The Truth About the Economy. You can get that on Amazon if you wish. And which I wrote in 2009 and published in 2010. That was 12 years ago. I said, it appears to me that China is building up their economy to compete in the Western financial system. And it wouldn't surprise me if China did a commodity-based yuan and challenged the dollar. I wrote that in 2009. That is 13 years ago. In fact, I did write it during the summer of 2009 because I wrote the book during the summer of 2009. I think I finished it in early August. So it's almost a year to the day when I wrote that China, I'm sorry, 13 years to the day when I wrote that China could challenge the Western financial system and the US dollar by using a commodity-based currency. It looks like those pieces are falling into place, and we'll get in the commodity portion of that here in just a moment. We talk about gold and all these new gold trading markets around the world and the exchanges. But essentially, I did call this. People thought I was nuts back then, but it's turning out to be true. And again, I just understand what China would want to do. If the dollar is destroying everything, they're exporting inflation and controlling markets, somebody's got to step up with an alternative. It wasn't rocket science. I'm not that smart to know that China would challenge it. I just called it 13 years ahead of time. You can read it in my book. It's publicly available. So there you go. You know, sometimes people don't accept it until it's blatantly obvious. Well, now it's blatantly obvious. You're seeing the evidence. But sometimes, you know, looking at it ahead of time, you can tell these things. I'm not always right, but a lot of times you kind of surmise what you think is going to happen. And you look at history, what's happened in the past, and history rewrites itself a lot of times. It's just, you know, same song, different verse, if you will. All right, Ding Dong, the Witch is Dead. This is very obviously a reference to the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz when talking about the dollar. Okay, who's the man behind the curtain for the dollar? It would be the owners of the Federal Reserve, the independent commercial banks, which own the shares. If the dollar loses its dominance, it will hit the U.S. economy, the quote says. It would likely hurt the value of the dollar and create inflationary pressure on the prices of consumer goods, Allianz Global Investors explained in a 2018 report. This is an investment research house. Ultimately, the United States' loss of reserve currency status may only limit any further decline in wages, and there's a good chance it would also make U.S. consumers a lot poorer. Yeah, and to give the Chinese and Russians to circumvent the U.S. system, collapse the U.S. Treasury market and the U.S. dollar, and force a reset of the financial system. So if you want to know what a cause for the financial system is, I think it's all the economic issues, which are leading to geopolitical issues, which will lead to bank issues, which will lead to debt issues, which will lead to stock market issues, which will lead to a deflationary collapse, which will lead to massive money printing, which will lead to the death of the Fed and the emergence of the system. Or the death of the Fed in its current iteration, it'll try to reinvent itself around CBDCs and you'll have the new system. So now we're starting to see how that new system is ultimately going to fall in place. I'm coming back to see if the super chats. I don't see any super chats. Audio check looks good. 219 in. Thank you, everybody, for joining. It's time before we get to the very last part of the presentation and tie in gold and silver and why you want to own it, because I do it on almost every one here in a sec. But I got to read the poll, guys. So now we have 106 votes in the poll. The poll concerns China, Russia, and a whole bunch of other nations stand up to the dollar and Western hegemony. The first option you could pick out of 4 is the BRIC currency unseats the dollar. The second is the BRIC currency fails to impress, meaning it fails. The BRIC currency weakens the dollar, meaning it competes but doesn't replace, or the dollar rules over the world forever. 5% said the last option, dollar rules over the world forever, leading with 51% of the vote says the BRIC currency weakens the dollar, not destroys, but weakens. This is what people think. The BRIC currency fails to impress. 5% say that. I think that's a pretty safe bet. I think the BRIC currency is here to stay in one form or another. And the BRIC currency unseats the dollar at 39%. Nice little battle there going on. I think eventually the BRIC currency unseats the dollar. I think those 39% of people are correct. But I also think the 51% that said the BRIC currency weakens the dollar is also correct, because I think it happens in stages. It'll weaken the dollar, and eventually it will unseat the dollar when the final stages of that reset happens. That's probably a couple of years away, sometime away, later on in this decade. But that's probably where we're going. Thank you, everybody, for answering the poll. We're going to go back to the PowerPoint presentation, because, ladies and gentlemen, we are not done. Of course, we're not done. It is only 6:07. We've only been going for 22 minutes. When have you ever known me to do a 22-minute live? We don't do those. No, I may have microphone power issues, and also I'm trying to keep these a little bit shorter and do more frequent reports for you guys. So we're not going to go too much longer, but I wanted to talk about gold. Of course, the reference to the famous James Bond movie with the most famous Bond actor here on screen called Goldfinger, and it was talking about a plan to basically alleviate the Western markets of their gold, a criminal plan. And I think that that is basically appropriate for the news I'm about to give you. Prime Minister Narendra Modi in India, this is reported in the Business Standard, so PM of India to launch international bullion exchange on July 29th. Ladies and gentlemen, that day has passed. It's been launched in India. Remember why they're doing this. Remember why gold's going to play a role in the new financial system and in the new currency systems. Basel III calls out gold specifically as a high-quality liquid asset. It's the only one that has ultimate monetary asset. When property titled, you have both chain of title and custody records, and you know it's yours and not anybody else, not rehypothecated, not remelted. When you know that, then gold has no true counterparty risk. And it's the only asset on central bank balance sheets that can say that, by the way. So it is the ultimate monetary asset, period, in a story. That hasn't changed. India opens its new exchange. France recently reopened their gold exchange. I talked about it in the program several times. China is expanding Shanghai metals markets with the help of JP Morgan. We talked about that last year at Silver Symposium last August 2021. We're going back out to Silver Symposium at the end of this August 2022. I'll be there. I'm going to talk about a little bit more about China and the Shanghai metals markets with the help of JP Morgan, and how the big international commercial banks are helping the other markets and the alternative currencies come up to power by supporting their markets. In other words, JP Morgan is helping China support its exchange markets, its commodity exchange markets, and no doubt doing some work around its currency and banking systems to help them. Other banks will do this as well. So if you expected JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs to refuse helping, you know, the alternatives, the BRICS nations were building a system, ain't gonna happen. So, and IMF is not either. The IMF is slowly pivoting east, so is the BIS. I mean, all of these things set up in the guise of the Western system want to live on past the demise of the Western system. So they're embracing the new kids on the block. That's the BRICS. Dubai and the Middle East markets expanding the gold exchanges as well. Dubai has come out and just completely criticized the London market, and the London market was trying to bully Dubai. Dubai said, no way. India, China stood up for Dubai. And you can see now where there's a polarization in the actual gold markets and the gold exchanges. And that's going to break the collusive impact that the LBMA and the COMEX right now have on those commodities markets and the PM market specifically over time, not overnight. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but over time. These are all processes. Processes take time, but that is indeed what's occurring. And all of these countries I just mentioned have openly criticized US and UK markets for their lack of consistency and the bully behavior of the Western market institutions. What is the next phase? Of course, we have reference to the Crazy Rich Asians movie. That was a popular manifestation of the emergence of China and other Asian nations, along with other similar nations with similar interests like Russia, India, the Middle Eastern ones. And this is epitomizing how those nations are rising up, specifically China and much of Asia, Southeast Asia, over the previous dominant nations like Japan, Europe, North America, Australia, so on and so forth. So what is the next phase, however, for Russia and China to complete this payment system and to complete the inner workings and the plumbing that will allow their new BRIC currency to work and really compete with the dollar in real everyday terms, in terms of international transactions and finance? What needs to happen? Well, I got a few things for you on the screen. I'm just going to talk about 4 big ones. There's probably about a zillion little ones, but we just want to talk about the big ones. What are the strategic moves that Russia and China need to work to free themselves from SWIFT and the international payments? They need more work. The various independent precious metals and commodities markets need to mature and collaborate. We talked about that. Further advancements and adoption of digital transaction technologies would help route non-dollar transactions around the Western collage of financial systems. It is a collage of systems built over time, many of them old and decrepit, but still there, still the standard. And China and Russia don't have all of those plumbing pieces yet. They may be missing a toilet here or there. They may be missing some PVC. You know, they're missing pieces. So it's going to take a little time. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but they're clearly en route and underway. And when they formally go out to the news and say, we're going to do this, that means they feel they have most of the mechanics in place, either already in place or being built right now, that they can go ahead and announce it. Because what's the Western system going to do? If the Western system cuts them out, they can't trade with them, it collapses all markets. Chinese and Russians know this. All right, last point. IMF and the BIS, that is International Monetary Fund and the Bank for International Settlements, will more formally pivot toward the BRICS nations and the Middle East nations joining. But they will do so, in my opinion, only when excuses present themselves, meaning they're not going to go over and say, I declare for China, Russia, and the BRICS nations. I declare. No, they're not going to do that. What they're going to do is they're going to wait till stuff breaks, and they're just going to magically say, well, you know what? We have this other system over here. They're going to put a policy paper out, news statements out that say, we formally recommend that the international trading community use the new currency put in place by Russia and China because, you know, the Western system is breaking down. Maybe you want to start rolling some of your transactions and your reserves over to this new currency, and that's what's going to happen. So the IMF and BIS won't look like the bad guys. They're going to look like, hey, we just collaborate with these guys. We know what's going on, but we don't determine the strength of the dollar. We don't determine the strength of currencies, and they're going to escape blame. They think they're going to escape blame, even though the new system being put in place was put forth based upon research by the IMF and the bully power and the policy and regulatory power of the Bank for International Settlements over the Western system. But because the IMF and BIS are going to be over the new worldwide system, they want to include all the other nations. And the IMF and BIS do not want to alienate the Western system because they want to utilize them. Why? Those institutions make money off of transactions, loans, things like that. They want the system trading the way they want it trading. So one, they can have policy and influential referential control, research control, but also so that they profit from it. Makes no sense to only profit from half of the system if you can get the whole system competing with each other and profiting on either side by influencing all sides at the same time as advisors. And that's exactly what IMF and BIS do. And what it does is facilitate a trade which further enriches the elites of each country, although the balance of power between different country elites is definitely shifting. All right, that is just about it for the presentation. I'm going to leave the references cited up for just a bit and then come back over to the presentation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us on the podcast at all. We appreciate you having here. We have 255 in for August 2nd, 2022's presentation. China and Russia stand up to the US with a new world reserve currency. While you guys copy down or take screenshots of those references, I'm going to end the poll. 38% of you ended up saying the BRIC currency unseats the dollar or replaces the dollar. I think that's where we eventually get. The intermediate step, most of you voted for 54%, the BRIC currency weakens the dollar, which I think it's going to do immediately, and then growing in importance over time as the pieces are put into place and people rotate over, which we know they're going to do. And as the economic problems of the West manifest themselves and weaken the institutions that hold up the Western financial system, which will occur. 4% of you voted for the BRIC currency fails to impress, and that it fails in its mission. And that's good. That's 1 in 25. I think is about accurate. I think there is about a 4% chance it doesn't succeed at least providing an alternative, whether it unseats the dollar. And 4% of you said the dollar rules over the world forever. We're going to end that poll. Thank you, everybody, for voting in it. I do see a super chat from Brian Williams, who says, if a small mom and pop business began accepting silver for goods, would the powers that be bring the iron boot down on them, or what consequences would there be? That's a good question, because when you saw an independent guy, I think he was in one of the southeastern states, Alabama. Oh God, was it Alabama, Georgia, Carolinas, one of those states in that region, I believe, years ago, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, to 15 or 20, put out a silver coin. It was like Freedom Coin or something. They put it out and they were trading, and they would trade for goods and services. Well, he was also doing this in and around DC. The feds got wind of it, raided him, and basically shut him down, and he went to jail. I don't know if he ever got out, but at one point they hadn't even charged him. Anyway, so yeah, in limited instances where individuals try to present currencies like true and independent free market systems, the government shuts them down. However, you have states voting via their states' right, via the 10th Amendment, and the article of the Constitution that says gold and silver is money and nothing else should be legal tender, are standing on their states' rights and the Constitution in the definition of money in the United States to accept gold and silver in terms of payment and to remove taxes on them on resale, because they're money, not assets, or not commodities in the view of those states. So we've started to see states exercise their power. So states could do this. Local municipalities could pile on top of their state rulings and issue their own gold and silver backed currencies or alternative currencies. It could happen. But if individuals do that, yeah, they're going to put the boot down. If you have 30 states doing it, what they'll do is probably sue the states and try to take it to the Supreme Court. But if you go to the Constitution, I mean, that's very risky for them to do that, the money masters, because if you go back to that clause in the Constitution that says only gold and silver should be used in legal tender, you could upset the IRS, you could upset the Treasury, you could upset a lot of things in the economy, and you would basically kill the dollar. So I'm not so sure if that is the smartest move. So they're going to have to be careful how they do it. Good question. Thank you very much. Appreciate you asking that question. That was the only super chat today, ladies and gentlemen. And I'm just going to roll up through here talking while I look for other questions from you guys. Will you have John Williams and TF Metals on your vlog? Yeah, I've had TF Metals, John Williams before. It's been a long time from John Williams, just because sometimes it's hard to get him booked, and it's hard to get him to do video. Not that I mind that, but it's sometimes a little bit harder to coordinate. But I'll have him back on. He runs Shadow Stats, for those of you who don't know, and I love the guy, and I rely a lot on his work and appreciate what he does, because he's one of the guys exposing the government numbers. Of course, I do that in chapter 2 of my book, Drop Shadow: The Truth About the Economy, which you can get on Amazon for a few bucks. Where in chapter 2, I break down all those, just like John Williams does, but in my own style with my own presentation and my own research. And I agree basically with John Williams, because I've done my own independent research and wrote a book on it. What was the other question? Oh, TF Metals. Yeah, we'll have him back on for sure. I love Craig. He's a great guy. We like to rotate people on. In fact, I might reach out to him to do something this week or next. Thanks for the question. Charles McClendon with the contribution of $5. Thanks for helping out the channel, Charles. It is very much appreciated. We do have employees, and it does take a lot of time to do all this. And this does free me up to do the research for you guys. So I appreciate you guys supporting. Of course, there's another way that you could support. So what we're going to do is we're going to drop out of the current share, ladies and gentlemen. And we are going to go. And what we're going to do is put up on screen where you basically can get precious metals if you are interested in them, because we do that. If you go to goldsilverpros.com and you click on precious metals deals right here, goldsilverpros.com, precious metals deals, and you go down here and click on access deals for ARC Silver. There's a form you can fill out in which Ian will either text you back or email you back if you whitelist the email and phone number after you send that form, and he will give you the best deals on precious metals, pretty much guaranteed. Of course, we have that introduction at the beginning of every video talking to you guys about that, so I won't beat the dead horse. But we've had people coming in. There has been a confirmed, and I'm going to go ahead and announce this on the show because Ian and I talked about it, and it's basically a confirmed deal. Ian recently, from one of our subscribers, had he essentially had a $3 million order through Ark Silver. I think it was a mix of silver and gold. I didn't get all the details, but we're starting to see big orders. Of course, you saw Andy come on the program a couple of weeks ago and talk about that billionaire lady in Texas that ordered 50 million in precious metals, which he says comprised of 900,000 silver eagles and most of the rest of it in gold. That's a lot of money. I have word from several people that this is an extremely famous, very rich person that everybody know if I said it. But since I haven't personally confirmed it, I won't say it. But they are billionaires here in the US. Very super famous billionaires in the US just bought 50 million in gold from Andy and Miles Franklin. And we have had somebody buy $3 million in gold and silver from Ark Silver coming through our network. So we're starting to see these big purchases from wealthy individuals and family offices. That's going to continue to increase, I believe. And sales are going up at the bullion dealers. So don't worry about the gold and silver price. It has nothing to do with physical trade. I say that every time. The physical trade is strong, so stick with it. The smart money is starting to pile in. Billionaires and millionaires are piling in. We're starting to see it through our networks. And so that's going to continue to drain the silver. Next time I come on the program individually, either next live or later on this week, I'm going to go over the decreasing inventories on COMEX. I know we haven't done that in a little while, and you guys will want to see that for sure. I do that every couple of weeks just because it slowly drains, you know, so I don't want to hype it up every week, but we have seen a move off the industrial markets here in the US for silver, a lot of silver, and we're starting to see a little bit in gold, but silver's being taken off the market. Could be a lot of industrial demand and people securing their future inventories, but it could also be investors coming in and whacking that off the COMEX. Now, they may either come directly to the COMEX and get it, or you could have big participating banks take it and then sell it individually to their customers for a markup. So I think that physical bullion trade's pretty darn strong here in the US. And I think that the rest of the countries are building their own markets, and they're going to remove the carte blanche, monopolistic, or maybe oligopoly over the precious metal markets that the UK and the US have right now. And that's coming. I talked about it. It's becoming blatantly more obvious. And remember, I'll talk about things before they become super apparent just because I put tea leaves together. I read a bunch of stuff, my mind works on it, and I put stuff together and I make calls. And most of the time they're pretty true. Sometimes they're not. Most of the time they are. Most of the time, most of the components are there. I might have missed a piece here or there because we didn't know it wasn't invented yet or talked about yet. But for the most part, I get the big system down and I do it way ahead of time. And this basic presentation, basically just to point that out, that, you know, when you do good research, and I'm not trying to toot my own horn, I'm just saying when anybody does good research, John Williams of Shadow Stats, Tavi Costa, TF Metals, Craig, all of us do good research. My friend Chris Marcus from Arcadia Economics, Michael Sayre, who does these great metals reports, and a good friend of mine who does these reports on Twitter. You know, we all do research, we all contribute. But if you do good research and you read the tea leaves and you listen to what they say in the financial news, you both alternative mainstream media, and you listen to the big super international banking organizations, and you know, you read some about the economy, you can piece this together. It's really not rocket science. When I wrote the book back in 2009, I was so surprised that people were all over me for writing that book. They were like, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And a lot of it really has come to pass. And I think the rest of it's coming to pass. And again, I'm not a savant. It's just reading the tea leaves, paying attention. You can start to do this yourself. And that's why I give it to you. I want you guys to learn. I'm not putting this behind a paywall. I'm not running a university where you got to bring a book or attend, you know, a virtual Zoom call. I'm putting this out for free for you guys because I want you to get this, because it's in all of our best interest that we all understand this, what's coming, so we can prepare for it and provide alternatives in our own lives and support alternatives, available alternatives within, you know, the system. Even though we don't control the system, a lot of times we can make wiser choices to stop some of this tyranny in the financial system, because when you have tyranny in the financial system, it leads to tyranny everywhere else. And that's why we're here. So thank you everybody for joining. We peaked at about 270 users. Thank you for the contributions from Brian Williams and Charles McClendon. Thank you everybody for joining the program. This has been Cowboy Metals Live, Tuesday, August 2nd, 2022. I'm Rob Keats, your host. We're broadcasting from the great state of Texas and take no bullshit. And the title of this presentation is China and Russia Stand Up to the US with a New World Reserve Currency. We're going to call it, guys. Thank you so much for attending, asking questions, participating. Thank you, Peter, for riding shotgun as moderator. Thank you, everybody else, for showing up. We appreciate it. We'll see you. We'll be back Thursday with more content. Just like usual, you guys are going to like it. Lots more research. Till next time, this is Rob Keats with Gold Silver Pros.